Good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Luigi Ricciardiello. I'm Associate Professor of Gastroenterology at the University of Bologna. I'm actually specialized in colorectal cancer prevention, and I'd like to thank the IDF for having me here today. It's a great honor, and I'll be talking about the possible role of dairy products towards colorectal cancer development protection. This is my disclosure of conflict of interest. Now, colorectal cancer is one of the major causes of cancer incidence and death worldwide. It accounts for approximately 2 million colorectal cancer cases diagnosed each year worldwide, and it is also the third most common cause of cancer death worldwide. That is why it's actively researched, and in particular, there is huge research in prevention, both primary and secondary prevention. Now, to get to colorectal cancer, it doesn't take 1 or 2 years. The development goes through the intermediate steps of growth of premalignant lesions, in particular called adenomatous polyps. And this takes about 10 to 15 years. The important thing is that we are recognizing several factors that are playing a role in colorectal cancer development, which are acting on mechanisms that are relevant for cellular homeostasis in the stem cell compartment. And in particular, we are recognizing inflammation as a major role in colorectal cancer development. What are the risk factors of colorectal cancer? We recognize age, smoking, hereditary predisposition, which actually account for about 10% of all cases, in particular Lynch syndrome and familial adenomatous polyposis, long-term inflammatory bowel diseases. Alcohol consumption is now recognized as a major risk factor for colorectal cancer, together with type 2 diabetes and obesity. Obesity is a major risk factor for colorectal cancer. But of course, we are recognizing also dietary habits as key factors for the predisposition of development of the disease. Now, as far as age, we know that colorectal cancer risk increases with age. In particular, we have colon cancer screening programs that are designed from age 50 to 74, and that is because we have the highest peak of incidence. However, in recent years, we have been observing increases numbers of early onset colorectal cancer, where are cases that occur before the age of 50, which are very difficult to spot. They are always or almost always advanced cases, and they are poorly respondent. And this is occurring not only in the United States, which has actually measured this already 15 years ago, but also throughout Europe. And what we believe is that this sharp increase of early onset colorectal cancer is mostly driven by lifestyle changes, in particular obesity and dietary habits. And as a matter of fact, in the United States right now, early onset colorectal cancer accounts for approximately 10% of all colorectal cancer cases. But of course, we recognize, as I said, obesity because it leads to changes in the systemic changes, including circulating cytokines, but mostly changes also in the gut microbiome, which actually perpetrate the sustainability of inflammation, which actually would change proliferation and apoptosis in the colonic lumen. And as I was saying, diet is also playing a huge role in colorectal cancer development. We recognize that the Western dietary pattern is strongly associated with colorectal cancer and also with adenoma development, as it is shown by this study that was recently published. And this is also important for early onset colorectal cancer, as opposed to, as we know, the Mediterranean diet, which as a protective effect toward the colorectal adenomas development. And as we know from recent meta-analysis, the Mediterranean diet is strongly protective toward colorectal cancer development. But what about dairy products? This is the topic of the main topic of my talk. Now, dairy products have been explored for almost 30 years in terms of protective effects towards colorectal cancer development. And this is the old meta-analysis from Aune and colleagues published in 2012, which clearly showed from pooling cohort studies that total dairy products, including the analysis of high versus low intake, together also with a dose response analysis per 400 grams daily, are strongly protective towards colorectal cancer. But also, and this was mainly driven by the consumption of milk. As you can see from this slide, that milk was found to be protective both when analyzing high versus low intake or intakes of 200 grams daily in the populations that were explored. This was not found, on the other hand, from cheese, both when analyzing high versus low intake and consumption of 50 grams daily. But other studies subsequently have shown protective effect of dairy products toward colorectal cancer. In particular, an analysis of 11 years follow-up of the EPIC cohort found a strong protective effect from total milk consumption, also from whole fat and skim milk, while there were some mixed data on cheese and yogurt because they were showing some protective effect in the categorical models, but not in the linear models. What is really interesting is that as people always believed that calcium was one of the main key factors explaining the protective effect of dairy products in terms of colorectal cancer development. What was found was that dairy sources of calcium were inversely associated to colorectal cancer development, as opposed to non-dairy calcium, which were not associated. And I will get into this topic in a minute. Other meta-analyses have also corroborated this data on dairy products. What was really interesting from this meta-analysis published in 2018 was that the data on dairy was even stronger per, of course, increased number of servings, as opposed to other well-known protective factors towards colorectal cancer, such as fruit, vegetables, and whole grains. Of course, this was also corroborating the knowledge that red meat and processed meat have a pro-carcinogenic effect in terms of colon cancer development. And finally, there was a very recent study, which is a subsequent follow-up of the EPIC cohort, which found a strong protective effect of several types of foods and food components towards colorectal cancer development, as opposed to others, and clearly a demarcation within this volcano plot, showing that cheese and milk are highly protective. But what are the possible mechanisms behind the protective effects? It was known that, for example, the dairy products would, bind to pro-inflammatory secondary bile acids and ionized fatty acids, which would reduce cell proliferation and promote cell differentiation. And furthermore, it was believed that calcium had a chemopreventive effect because of direct growth restraining and differentiation and apoptosis-inducing action. But what is really interesting, recent data, this is a very well-conducted study, which was published in the England Journal of Medicine in 2015, which actually randomized patients at high risk for recurrent adenomas, showed no protective effect from calcium carbonate to 1,200 milligrams daily, as opposed to no calcium intake, indicating that there is a huge difference probably between dairy source of calcium as opposed to the administration of calcium carbonate. Also, there is a huge interest in fermented foods. In particular, initial data indicated that yogurt consumption has a protective effect towards colorectal cancer development. This has been published within the EPIC cohort. What is really interesting, of course, is that you see an increase in effect, protective effect, based also on the level of intake, and this was higher in men as opposed to women. But recently, a meta-analysis also corroborated this knowledge, indicating a protective effect of yogurt towards colorectal cancer, in particular, a stronger effect on rectal cancer. Now, this difference between colon and rectal cancer needs to be further explored, and there is no information on what this might be triggered. Also, kefir has been recently studied. Initially, it was studied as a possible, trying to understand whether there were some direct effects on colon cancer cells. And what was found was that kefir has an effect by inducing apoptosis in cancer cells. A and B panel are Keiko2 cells, and C and D are HT29. These are models of colorectal cancer. And as you can see, the number of apoptotic cells were, were higher in cells that were treated with kefir as opposed to milk. But also, kefir was taken into the animal models of colorectal cancer, which is a chemically induced, the adoptive methane model, which showed that exposing the animals to kefir reduces the number of tumors and also reduces the size of tumor. And this is mostly driven by reduced inflammatory markers like TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, interleukin-17A. And this is something that is relevant, as I was discussing before, that inflammation is a relevant factor in promoting colorectal cancer. Finally, I think all this data has to be taken into consideration with what we are now studying, which is how diet is actually changing and modulating the gut microbiome. Diet, we know that is the major factor changing and modulating the gut microbiome, which is also relevant in changing the host immunity and also, in relation also to the risk of colorectal cancer. Now, we know that there are specific bacterial strains that are strongly associated with colorectal cancer development. In particular, Fusobacterium nucleatum has been found to be strongly associated with colorectal carcinoma and adenoma. As a matter of fact, if we expose an animal model like the APC mean mouse model, which makes a lot of polyps, we can boost the carcinogenesis, increase the number and the size of these polyps. But also, if we use a different type of animal models, but also in humans, and if we provide high-fat diet, we can see, this is an animal model, that the high-fat diet can strongly promote colorectal tumorigenesis by modulating the gut microbiota, in particular with the enhancement of Allistipes species. And as opposed to by using and modulating the gut microbiota, for example, with the Mediterranean diet, we have actually recently published that if we use make a Mediterranean diet mix and we provide this to animals, we can actually reduce the number and size of tumors, opposing the effect of a high-fat diet. And this has a strong effect by addressing the microbiota structure in a more protective fashion. And this has been also widely explored, or has been recently explored in dairy products, in particular in fermented milk products. And as you can see, the effect of fermented milk products have been found to be, protective in a sense by, redressing the gut microbiome in a more protective, strains, but also by increasing the level of short-chain fatty acid, which are actually immune modulators and prevent cancer development. And finally, kefir, for example, has been used in an animal model of colorectal cancer, which is the DMH rat model, showing that kefir can reduce the tumor number and size by reducing also the inflammatory markers in this setting and changing the gut microbiome with a more protective structure. So in conclusions, we know that colorectal cancer is a preventable disease. There is overwhelming evidence that dairy products can prevent colorectal cancer. There is also strong indication that matrix effect is probably critical. Think about, the dairy calcium as opposed to the supplemented calcium. Of course, we need to have more mechanistic evidence understanding the preventive effects, but there is strong indication that fermented milk products act through modulation of the gut microbiota, and this has a critical effect on reducing inflammation and, of course, risk of colorectal cancer. And I'd like to thank you all for being with me today, and thank also to the organizers.